Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. My name is Jamie, and I'm with the Business Times. And I've got, of course, four very distinguished gentlemen that with us today. We're going to talk about data. You've heard the cliches. Data is the new oil. It is maybe the new commodity. It is also, for Facebook in recent times, perhaps the new liability. And we're going to talk about how regulators think about data, how corporations should think about data, and especially for banks, how they should be thinking about data as well. Maybe we'll start talking about GDPR. It's not the most exciting, sexy topic, admittedly. If you see on Twitter today, one photo that I think aptly describes what GDPR does is putting up glass doors for toilets. And that's been trending around, which is to say that privacy is not really there. We put up a glass window, and that's about it. But maybe start with you, David. How do you think that has changed? Of course, right, you start with the regulator. We talk about regulations. How do you think it is reshaping how we think about data privacy, if at all, or the responsibilities behind using data?
Well, thanks for the question. I think, OK, so GDPR, whether you kind of agree with it or disagree with it, has definitely kind of woken us all up, perhaps in a bit of a rude awakening. The underlying principles within GDPR, effectively are in ascertaining, the privacy, the ownership of data down to individual, the ability of having data portability, and to a certain extent, I mean, the right to be forgotten. And I think fundamentally these principles are exceptionally important. What would be interesting, and I really say this from a genuine curiosity, because we're all observing what's now happening in EU, is how it will be implemented and how it will roll out and what will be the implications associated. Because GDPR, while they're very good principle, they're also actionable and enforceable with quite draconian elements associated with that. So I think it's very admirable, but we're monitoring.
Yeah, how far will it go? And also as a consumer, right, we've got several emails about GDPR, right? And the question is, did we click? Or one more email would have moved all of that into spam, right? Which is, a bit ironic in itself.
Well, I was very happy with the emails. I just ignored all of them.
Exactly, right? So the question is, would consumers take on to that? And maybe some of the bankers could talk about it. Shameek, would you like to comment on that? Do you think consumers are waking up to this?
I think, first of all, I think GDPR has a few very specific new requirements. But actually, the thing that makes GDPR unique is really the size of the stick, the potential loss to companies, and therefore it finally becomes real. But actually, if you look at what is inside GDPR, with a few exceptions, most of our geographies, including Singapore and Hong Kong, have very similar regulations in place. So to David's point, I think it is more of a wake-up call. I don't actually think consumers outside Europe have fully grasped the full implications of it and the extent to which it has the potential to hand them the power back. And I think, as David says, it will be very interesting to see how that evolves.
Samir, would you like to maybe comment a little bit?
I think I agree with David. I think GDPR is giving us the urgency. I think the principles are fundamental principles that we need to, and we have been thinking about for some time as an industry. But with the stick, the urgency is a lot higher. But I think the key will be in getting the balance right, because there are black and white is easy, but most of the things in decision is a balance between you want to leverage data to improve your consumer's life, your customer's life, but at the same time, how much of that is a balance? You want to do it that it's not creepy, it's useful, and it's a fine balance between that. And where do you? One of the things I struggle with, and I want to watch out in GDPR, I hope it doesn't restrict innovation, because people are afraid. So I think that's where trying to find the balance, it's all going to be how they actually apply it and see what they look at it.
On the point of being afraid, just to chirp in, is the lawsuits already in.
Already?
Yeah.
So
I think within the day or the day after GDPR was officially activated, the lawsuits already came in.
Go ahead,
I
Sassoon.
just had a few comments as well. So GDPR, obviously meaning General Data Protection Regulation, this is I think, a seismic shift where we've seen a regulator within a region implement a regulation which has global ramifications. So for the first time, if there's any consumer or business that touches the EU, is captured by this regulation. So we haven't seen this before. So the first question is asked, if the EU's done this, are there going to be other regulators globally that might do this as well? GDPR is two sides of the coin. One is corporations have to comply, and at Salesforce we also have to make sure we educate our customers how we comply and how they should comply, and we've done a trial in relation to that. But it also gives consumers better knowledge of their rights as well as consumers. An interesting observation I read recently regarding GDPR, obviously privacy is very important, making sure you design products privacy by design and having privacy built in from the very start of the process when you build products. But an interesting observation from the International Association of Privacy Professionals estimated that as a result of the GDPR, as many as 28,000 data protection officers in Europe and the US will have to be established. Now that's a huge number. Yep. And this is separate to chief privacy officers, which organisations have. So it's not just the privacy, but it's also processing the data. Yep. That's very important.
Yeah, I mean, and the question is who's going to pay for these compliance officers too, right? You might say the businesses, but I would argue at some point perhaps the consumers are the ones that are going to be paying for that as well.
I think this comes to a matter of responsibility.
Right.
The more data companies either process or store, and this is a very different definition, right. The more data you have, I think you have more responsibility, whether it's to your customers or to your consumers. Yeah,
but in some point, actually, the corporation should not be holding data in perpetuity. So actually, you shouldn't be holding that much data. So I would worry about the banks that have holding, terabytes and gigabytes and that much data. It makes you wonder how far are they going to triangulate who you are. A bit of a creep factor coming in here. David, you seem to be
deep in thought. I'm deep in thought because interestingly enough, if you look at actually a lot of the strategy for very large actually tech companies and actually organizations around the world, it's actually been the reverse. It's keep as much as possible. In fact, only recently I met one person that completely threw me off track. They said that as a policy, they're continuously looking how to expunge data effectively. And I was really taken aback. But I think actually now to this point, one of the things that GDPR has now forced everyone, because of the element of right to be forgotten, by saying, I want you to delete my data, I think everyone's kind of going, oh, how do we do that? How do we delete data? Yes. And it's actually a very important element because independently of whether as an individual I want to have my data deleted, it's having that ability in place to actually delete data.
Yeah, and it brings up to the point about open banking, right? Which every bank is realizing, oh, we have to partner up with people because you're all on your smartphones today, right? So you're banking around an app. You're not banking around a branch today, right? And so all the banks are trying to cozy up as much as possible, and certainly cloud computing will help with that, and so that's kind of why Salesforce is here. But it also brings in the idea of what UK is proposing, which is to say consumers should be able to switch on and switch off at any time. I should have the ultimate say of how much the bank should get in terms of data. But that creates a big problem, right? Because the banks, okay, hold on, now we're going to delete the data right now because the consumer says, let's delete it right now. It does create a lot of logistical issues, shall we say. What sort of the bankers, what do you think?
A couple of things around it. One is, banking comes under regulation. So there is AML, there is a lot of regulation around know your customers and other things. So for that, and there's a lot of fraud regulation, sanctions regulation, and for that you need to store data and you need to be able to manage it and every year do that. That's one part of it. So if somebody comes and says, you know what, forget my data, how do we manage the risk part of it? So there is it's about making sure what is the data that you have and what is the use that you're doing. I think fundamentally, my personal belief, it's very difficult to say what data you store. We should be focused on how are we making sure we are using a responsible use of the data rather than trying to say what data, because it's very difficult to say what data is useful at what perspective.
But it's hard to define what responsible, because it sounds like a mission statement that you know. Well, Shameek, what do you
maybe we can take this broad area of data governance and split it up into a few underlying things. And by the way, many of these are conflicting, so it's not black and white. You have data privacy, which is the one that we're all talking about. You've got cross-border data sharing. You've got data retention.
Yep.
You've got data quality governance. And thanks to David, first regulator in the world, you now have data usage
you
governance.
give them some more work to do, David.
And I think it's important to understand that dealing responsibly, as you say, there is no clean answer to this. I would, however, challenge the thinking that banks are particularly in a difficult spot. If anything, do you really think we have more icky data than Facebook, than even LinkedIn or Apple or anybody?
Yeah.
Banks actually keep data that most people would know is shared. When you send a payment, you know somebody else is getting it. When you send a cross-border payment, you absolutely know somebody else is getting it. When you do your CDD, you absolutely know you've given your data. So if anything, actually banks have far less data. Every time somebody comes and talks to me about my big data strategy, I say, what big data? Banks don't have big data in the same way that some of the large technology companies do, right? So I think with the infrastructure and the thinking that we have around data governance, I would say we should be in a position to try and weigh between AML, CDD, data retention, data quality, AI governance, all of these. It's tough, but at least in banking, we have the regulatory guide rails to get us going.
So we'll have to talk about trust quotient a bit, but Sassoon,
I just want to challenge that thought. So I think one of the big challenges in financial services today with open banking and the use of APIs is that you're going to see a change how banks potentially see the data they govern. So I think banks traditionally see themselves as a stewardship role in terms of the customers' data they have, whether it's lending or savings account or credit information they have. But now, with just the explosion of data and open banking and the use of APIs, that data that potentially is within financial services can be commercialized with the permission of the customer, of course. So with that opening up that technology and that opportunity, you're going to have potentially customers choosing different services they want to receive if they choose to do so. There has to be a lot more oversight in terms of that data because you're going to have a lot more third parties involved as well now, potentially. So this is, I think, challenging the traditional concept of what data governance is at the moment, particularly in banking, and what it will be in the future.
I mean, you work in, sorry, just a follow-up. I mean, you work in technology in itself. Can technology help in this area in making decisions, right? Where banks can say, let's turn this off, let's turn that off, let's govern, let's put these in silos. I mean, how far can technology go?
It's interesting because David and I were having this side conversation before and talking about technology. Often it's not the technology is the issue.
It's the people, isn't it?
It's the people who are managing the technology is the issue. So it's, I think, having the right, whether it's the frameworks in place to manage that. But I don't challenge whether it's the technology. So I think it's more the people managing the process.
David, you had...
No, I just something interesting that Sassoon mentioned in terms of the commercialization of data. I actually wanted to challenge your challenge and say the interesting thing about GDPR is while previously, your data, my data, was effectively sold, ironically, back to us. What GDPR actually now says is that you kind of have to give that data if I tell you to, at no cost. So it kind of puts a very interesting new dogma, a new paradigm to how the equation works, but actually it's retaining back that ownership by saying, hold on a second, that is mine. Now, I find it very interesting because we'll see whether will happen now that we start getting dividends.
Yep. So there's a repricing of data. There's a bit of a price arbitrage almost at some point, where Stanchart and DBS may at some point have to bid for my data.
I think even for us, it's about what, so if I look at Google, right? I am a Google since Google started. I give Google data. I know every time I use the maps, I use that, I give them data. Why am I doing it? Because there's a value exchange for me. I'm getting something. So banks traditionally have to think about what is the value exchange? What is the competitive spirit, and there has to be a value exchange. You have to provide value to get something. So I think it's just expanding the scope of that value exchange and thinking about it. Nobody gives you anything just because it's free and it's of no use. It's because they get something in return that you have that.
Interesting you bring that up, because I was just having a conversation with the president of the Asian Development Bank to take that track. And we know that. I think the large number, if not all the people in the audience know that. But actually the question is, does everyone know that? Does everyone know that by actually using the service that I'm using for free, in fact, it's not for free? And I think, and that's why I'm saying, to me personally, the principles of GDPR are good, because what it's saying is it's forcing the companies by having that disclosure element by saying, hold on a second, yes, you're giving it to me, you are getting a service, but that's the commercial agreement. Otherwise, you need to pay me. That's essentially the alternative. And I think that degree of awareness is exceptionally important, because personally, I have no problem giving my data, because you're giving me something. But someone may say, well, no, hold on a second, I have a problem. So that's one dimension. The second dimension is extremely interesting, is you're using the maps to get the service of the maps. But now they're using that data, potentially, or any other organization, to prepare you latte. You're good with getting that one service. Do you want to get the other one? So it's how do you start slicing it effectively?
Let's ask the audience, how many of you are aware that as a Facebook user, you're not the consumer, you're the product? How many of you are aware of this? Let's have a show of hands. Well, it's not too bad.
This is a very informed audience. It's a biased audience.
Preaching to the converted, I think.
It just sounds odd by saying you are a product. I am a product.
I am a product.
We should, David.
Yeah. Probably we get to some kind of a Facebook anonymous. Hello, I'm a Facebook user. How do you think about the trust quotient for banks? All right. I mean, we talked about value, right? But I think banks have started with this is very costly for me, right? With some thanks to the regulator as well. But there is also a trust quotient, which is to say, I think perhaps consumers trust us a little bit more than maybe insofar as rather I think there's a responsibility for the banks. How do you think banks should trade off that?
So let's take the Facebook example. What happened with Facebook, and it's continuing to happen with Facebook. If that happened with any bank, do you think that, I mean, would it be like a bimp in their market share and then market value?
Yeah, we noticed the share price has gone right back.
Yeah, gone back. So banks, have a trust, and it's a multiple because they handle monetary, and therefore the onus and the trust is very different. Typically, we are also regulated very differently. Third, our relationship with the customer is built on trust because we handle customers' money and we have to handle that. And therefore, banks have to think of it in a broader perspective. Traditionally, banks have always been very conservative in terms of even using the data that they have. We are now starting to say, okay, how can we balance it and make sure that the data that we have, how can we use it to bring more value add to our consumers? But then comes the whole, what is value add for one person might not be value add for another person. So how do you bridge that in terms of usage? And there's no black and white. It's a difficult topic, and there is working through use cases after use cases to try and get there.
Shameek?
So I'll take a slightly more flippant version of the same thing. My response to GDPR is, excellent. Now every other industry faces a little bit of what we face.
Gets a little bit of understanding.
I actually don't think banks are particularly complaining about the cost of GDPR. I actually think it's non-banks. It's everyone else who's never been exposed to. I mean, all the things I talked about, every one of them has a policy in my bank. Every one of them has a policy owner. There is a person in the bank who lose their job and the right to work in banking if any of these goes wrong. Which other industry has that? Possibly healthcare, possibly. No other industry has that. So as far as I'm concerned, excellent that GDPR is finally leveling the playing field.
You got to spread the pain all around, isn't it?
I think it's a question of looking at what your point and your point about what value does a bank bring. Why am I allowed to take your passport details when I'm opening your bank account, or now your my info details? There is a service I'm providing you. That service is the stamp of trust that this person is allowed to make payments through New York or through London or through any other international location without the worry of AML or sanctions. That is a service back, right? That has a cost. All GDPR is doing, and regulations like that is doing, is making that cost transparent and perhaps leveling the playing field a bit across industries.
I would add though, actually in the data era also, banks should also make their fees a lot more transparent too, right? So not just the cost, right? You should make the fees more transparent so everybody knows what you're paying for at the same point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have a point of view on the trust quotient for banks?
Well, I completely agree, and I think this is why at times I think banks and financial institutions get the short end of the stick by saying you're not innovating enough. But everyone forgets that they are heavily regulated. Yeah. And that if I'm not picking on Facebook, but just use it as a recent example, the share dipped, and then the representation of trust, the share went back up. If a bank would have done that, it would have been catastrophic. Yes. It would have been absolutely catastrophic. And I think that is something that is in the back of a lot of people by saying, I can't take that risk effectively. Yeah. So having this brought up more to our upfront agenda actually emphasizes the importance of building that trust. And again, it's a two-way system trust. It's not just the bank or any financial institution saying, I need to earn your trust. Yeah. It's vice versa. You need to understand as a consumer, well, hold on a second, what do I need to have trust in the fact that I'm providing you data? Yeah. Or am I aware of what may happen with this? I'm getting this underlying service, am I aware what happened? What is my rights? What is not my rights, and so forth. So it is a learning process. We are figuring it out. And to Shameek's glee, it is, I guess, leveling the playing field to a certain degree.
Misery does love company. So I just want to ask you about, there's also been a time where people have been confused about cloud technology, right? Where they say, I'm not sure, is it as safe? What does this mean for my data? As people talk about GDPR, as they start talking about data privacy, what does this mean for cloud computing in terms of regulators' understanding of cloud computing or the average person's understanding?
I think in the past few years, we've seen a fundamental shift in the understanding of cloud. Yeah. In the past, many organizations have hosted their data as infrastructure as a service rather than software as a service. When you're in the cloud, your software in a service, you don't have to do updates that are automatically done for you. There's a lot of protection and security around that, more so if you were to do it yourself potentially. So I think what we've seen, people were talking about the digital economy a couple of years ago. The digital economy is the economy. We're talking about cloud to host data. Well, that's how people host data now. It's just the way things are. But if I can just briefly go back on the trust issue, the issue with trust, I think, is important for whatever organisation you're in, whether it's banking or technology. It has to be consistent. You have to be persistent at it. I'm saying this with a regulator right next to me as well.
Careful now.
And trust varies in markets. I mean, Singapore here, obviously banks have a very good reputation. In Australia, banks are going through a royal commission at the moment, inquiry. Very notion the trust is being tested. And I mean, let's face it, the biggest companies in the world right now are technology companies. And there's all sorts of discussion about that, but I think as a technology company, as companies that are having more influence in this space, you've got to be more responsible as well. So, but trust is something that has to be continually worked at. It's not resolved. It's something you constantly have to persist with.
Okay. I wanted to go to the next point about the creep factor. So the banks have been a bit wary about coming too close. So if you put in $25,000 in your deposit account, trust me, your bank knows, right? And they could actually call you and say, would you like to do something with that $25,000? Can I give you a better deposit rate? But banks have also, in the last, I guess, a year or so, scaled back on that because they realized that's the creep factor. But at the same time, I'm sure they're feeling aggrieved that Facebook is with me all the time and there's no creep factor when it comes to Facebook or Google or...
Really?
Oh, really? You're fine with it?
No, I think it has a creep factor.
I think now it does, right? Maybe 6 months ago, before Facebook happened, before Cambridge Analytica happened, perhaps there was not that. Maybe you talk about that creep factor. How do your banks think about that creep factor?
So I think, again, we have data, and what we want to do, especially on the digital world, is personalize as much as possible. And really the scope of personalization is to make it easier for the consumer to get to. So let's say if I log into the DBS app, I should get a different view versus David logs in, just because we've been doing things differently and our needs at that point are different. That means using the data to personalize. Now, again, it has to be, is this an acceptable use case? I think it would be for most people, but then what is not acceptable? Are your transactions that you use on your credit card, which is used to personalize the offer that you should see, is that acceptable? So I think it's really, we want to personalize from an intention of helping our consumers and reduce the time that they spend, rather than say, you do everything even though I know you. But where does it become creepy? It's something that we are constantly challenging ourselves as well, and really working with the responsible use. Every use case that we work on, which is new, we actually take it through a committee within the bank, just to have different points of view as a consumer, as this, would it creep us out, would it not, is it helpful? And it's a discussion, because there's no, black and white is easy. It's all these shades of gray that's kind of difficult.
Shameek?
Yeah. So I think it is irresponsible for banks to depend on regulators or anybody else to tell us what to do. I think there is a critical difference between banks or any other traditional focused industry and a tech company. A tech company, or at least the platform companies, start with, let's get the data and let's figure out what services we can offer around
Later,
it.
right, yeah.
We are not in the business of doing that. I'm pretty clear. My bank is in the business of promoting prosperity and commerce in Asia, Africa, and Middle East. To the extent that we need to do that through the offering of financial services, and to the extent that data helps us with that, we will look at doing that.
Yeah.
But if I have access to that 25,000, and if there is no reason for me to believe that that gives the ultimate purpose, I'm not going to misuse that for something else, because I don't even have the license, and this is where back to the regulated point comes in. I don't have the license to try and offer something else on that.
I mean, meanwhile, startups can pivot at every 6 months, right? So they can change their mission statement every 6 months. So which
but
makes
fundamentally, banks are there to do banking, right? I mean, we are in a very boring business. I think banks should make a virtue of the boring business we are in. We're in the business of protecting your money, growing your money, moving your money, and if you need it, lending you money. That's all we are there for. Anything that is needed to support those objectives, to make the experience better, yes, as you said, Samir, we'll experiment, we'll look at what the boundaries are. But it's not that broader, and that's why you probably see banks naturally having a level of self-restraint on how much icky data to take on.
Yeah.
It's actually dangerous to take on too much data.
But then there are also the regulators that come in, right?
Yeah, well, I was about to say, so perhaps looking at it slightly differently in terms of creepiness, and perhaps kind of leaning towards misuse.
Yeah.
Which is a very important topic to think about, and it's a very difficult one, because at the same time we're all being pushed, we're all being told by all the bosses and everything, we have to innovate. And a lot of times, and I was asking this to Shameek yesterday, is what happens when you do something and you go, oops, actually we shouldn't have done it.
Yeah.
So in effect, and actually that's what we've been doing as a regulator, we put together the committee looking at the fairness, ethics, accountability, and transparency within AI. And the intention of that, actually talking about your point about fintech companies pivoting every other day or whatnot, it's meant to be applicable, again, not from a mandatory regulatory point of view, but it's meant to be applicable and relevant to both regulated entities as well as unregulated entities.
Yeah, fair enough.
Exactly for that point, because on the one hand, the regulated entities have that, from our point of view, that regulatory burden in terms of we need to always be licensed. We always need to think in terms of the compliance. We need to think and saying, okay, how do we still have those principles and mitigations, but at the same time allowing where relevant to innovate. But concurrently to look at the other side, which is a bit of a wild, wild west, and saying, guys, take this element in consideration and think about it to making sure that we do get the best. We all want the best. We all want to be the products, apparently. But at the same time, we avoid the potential pitfalls, which already have happened and would likely happen if we don't think about them. And essentially, I mean, we've already seen that tech companies have become what they are due to public opinion. And we've also seen tech companies disappear. Give the other one on Facebook, overnight, not so much, because of public opinion.
Right.
Now, what will happen in a situation when a company is phenomenal and goes into that creep factor and misuse, public opinion change, and they get destroyed? No one wants this kind of volatility in the industry, in the existing digital economy.
Well, I mean, banks have been regulated on the purpose of systemic risk. Do you cause risk to the system? So let's ask a hypothetical question. If Facebook were to collapse today, does it cause a systemic risk?
Okay. Perhaps it causes a systemic social risk, because so many people are dependent on Facebook for, well, everything.
For everything.
But from a financial perspective, no. However, that's now. Given the quite seismic push towards leveraging on cloud services and other providers, tech providers from a financial point of view, well, they may not still be a bank or financial provider, but now they're providing a systemically important infrastructure to the systemically important provider. So, yeah.
Yes, they have, right? So they become systemically important.
Yes.
So they
and this is why Zeke can kind of run away. No,
yeah. So at some point they might have to be regulated like a bank, right? Where data is their currency.
I think it's a question that's in everyone's in the back of the head.
Right? Is there some kind of capital requirement that and how should that be? I don't know. How do you convert that into something? We'll watch this space. Well, let's talk about ethics, which I mean, Singapore has started coming up with some data governance, some ways in which we should think about ethics. I know MES is looking into it. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Oh, okay. So let me first make it exceptionally clear, because I had got that question: is MES looking to define what is ethical and not ethical?
Yeah.
No.
Really?
We are not going to go about defining what is
leave.
ethical and not ethical. I think that's an exceptionally
yeah.
dangerous pitfall that none of us, I think, want to go into, because ultimately ethics is a cultural and a societal element. But what is important, and we've had many conversations with the industry, and we realized because this world of AI and data, and actually there was in the previous conversation with Zekin about data bias, there is potential misuse, there's potential pitfalls, there's potential exclusion. Effectively, the mirror of everything we want to achieve, everything we don't want to achieve.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't get caught up on the hype, which a lot of times I get caught in, and ignore it. So the intention about it is really looking at how do we avoid this situation. So for example, and I'll give you a very simplistic example of the predicament that the world of data when it comes to ethics poses. So we all talk about discrimination, and I think all of us can collectively agree that one should not discriminate. But the whole purpose of data is to discriminate. So
how do you do it?
Exactly how do you do it? And I'll give you another example where you have scenarios where discrimination is perfectly legit. For example, you wouldn't offer pregnancy insurance to a man. You need to kind of know the gender. However, in other scenarios, it shouldn't be relevant. So how do we define these things? How do we, on the one hand, don't get all sporadic in terms of, we can't do these things, but actually it becomes extremely important. So the thing is, and I'm being honest about it, and this is part of the conversations that we're having with the industry collectively, we don't know. We don't have the answers.
The regulators saying they don't know.
We don't know, and I don't think any regulator, and I want to speak on behalf, maybe they are, and I'd love to speak to them if they do, knows this. And this is why we kind of take a step back and saying, we need to sit down and have a discussion, come up with guidelines, meaning they're not enforceable by nature, that really puts us all in a more of a societal kind of right mind and right thinking. Some of them may in turn become regulatory enforceable. And this is kind of why it's both for the regulated and unregulated, because it depends on the services that you provide vis-a-vis the licensing from a banking perspective that's more applicable. But it's a question that and it's hard questions that we all need to kind of start addressing.
I mean, the question is data that predictive? And if it really is, should we go so far as to use that?
So if you think of all the AI, and if you break it down into its very, very core component, what it is trying to do is trying to figure out if there are two people, A and B. It's just trying to figure out which is A and which is B, which is discrimination. Which is just, so to me, all machine learning models, all of AI, all that it does, either A, B, good, bad, face, my face, Shameek's face, that's all it's trying to do. And the better it is in discriminating, the better the model is. So that's the fundamental premise of that. Now, having said that, I think we have, as part of the ethical use of that, we have to have frameworks, we have to have guidelines which help us. Let's say we build a model. And what is acceptable, which model is acceptable? Is risk pricing based on a credit loan, is that acceptable to do that? But can I discriminate because somebody is staying in one locality versus another? Those are gray areas. So a framework which, as an industry we are coming up, but within internally we work with a framework in terms of peer reviews, not letting just blindly following it, but following a framework to make sure that we are conscious of those biases and choices that we are making.
Just to jump in on that exceptionally important point, and actually bringing it back to GDPR, there's two elements of it, and which introduced by GDPR to all, is the right to challenge. So I think it's important because, for example, Samir does an application on me and says, David, you're in this bucket. I need to have the right to say, well, hold on a second, I think you're wrong. be it a matter of providing data to help correct it or to provide the justification.
Yeah.
The risk that we all face in this inability to opt out or not to have choice is that you're forced to discriminate into one bucket and you can't get out of it.
Yes.
So that's the one. The second element is making sure that this justified, whatever it will be, approach is indeed that. It's justified. And it's not a matter because of this bias in the data. And that's a very difficult thing, because how do you know that the data actually doesn't represent the biasness that we've always been doing?
So where does the tech company again come in with all of that? I mean,
Yeah, so look, first of all, I think we should welcome IMDA's announcement yesterday to set up this advisory council to look into AI and ethics. I think it's needed and it should be welcomed. Definitely, we welcome that initiative. One thing we have to look at with AI, though, we have to look at it from a universal, global point of view. I think there is legitimate reasoning to think about having a universal code for ethics for AI. In fact, in the UK, in the United Kingdom, the House of Lords debated this. They came up with a report last year. That was one of the recommendations they came with, but they also came up with 5 principles with AI, and this had to do with making sure it's for the common good, it was for humanity. AI wasn't used to hurt or destroy, and we need some type of framework. But we also need to have a framework that will adjust to future scenarios. We're thinking AI right now in our technological understanding of how it can apply to today, whether it's driverless vehicles or providing higher end services that we can do right now, predictive analysis. But there are a whole bunch of uses for AI that we probably haven't yet to think about how it can be used in the future. But I think that having some type of universal code is something that we should be thinking about.
But do you think the pressure for profit and the fact that we are moving towards a sort of model where there are just that few, I mean, how many Facebooks are there? There's just one, right? Do you think that would get in the way of principles? I mean, at the end of the day, they have to make money. Certainly, at some point, I hope Facebook makes, I'm sure they want to make more money. And the point that they are the only social media platform today. Google is the same.
Yeah, I mean, on Facebook, our founder and CEO has made public comments about that. So I won't repeat them, but you can easily search for them and see them. But, this all comes back down to my earlier point about having responsibility. The larger you are, the more data that you have, you've got to be more responsible. And that means thinking beyond, what your quarterly results are, thinking beyond what your shareholders want, but what you're contributing to society as a whole. And I think that is something that we, as an industry, are going through right now, because the implications of what we're doing has societal impact.
We used to talk about banks about being too big to fail. I think certainly some tech companies will meet that conversation at some point, right, where it's too big to fail.
Yeah,
I mean,
but whether it is banks or tech companies, I think to some extent we are missing the wood for the trees, or whatever, it's the other way around.
Yeah.
If we think too much about AI ethics and AI regulation, I mean, let's look at what we're trying to say underneath. We're saying, do not discriminate against somebody unfairly. Well, don't humans discriminate today, right? They do. So ultimately, what does AI and a lot of data do? It makes it more difficult for those who are trying to ensure that such inappropriate outcomes don't happen to oversee it. So instead of focusing on a brand new framework for AI governance, what we need to focus for, in my opinion, is how do we make sure that AI data analytics is there as a servant to humanity rather than the other way around. That's all I think we need to ensure. Otherwise, the fundamental responsibility hasn't changed.
It's basically saying don't use AI as an excuse to discriminate, right? Does it worry you guys that in time when machines come about, they might just need a warm body to prosecute at some point? Do you all worry because one of you is chief data analytics officer, one of you is in charge of data? Do you worry about that when you think about people using data to that point where it's almost runaway, right? And you can't even turn that clock around.
So
have you buying more insurance?
Yeah, I've read all the doomsday books
Yes.
on this topic, and there was a time when I was in a pretty deep funk on that. But actually, I think it's like worrying about something that may or may not happen versus doing something about the things we can influence.
Sure.
There is a level of the singularity, etc., which is sitting out there, which frankly, beyond me at least, maybe not beyond others. On the other hand, there's something we can do today, now, about treating our customers and staff fairly, not doing things that we would be ashamed if it came onto the front page of the FT or the Business Times. Those things don't change. As long as we make sure that we are governing the use of data, AI, internally and externally appropriately, I think that's all we can do at this point.
Yeah. I just really want to jump in because it actually goes back to Sassoon's point. Yeah. It's about responsibility. It's social responsibility. And the reason I bring that up is because, and I would like to challenge AI and challenge all of us how we've been thinking about AI. Even from the birthing place of research and so forth, I actually think we've been all approaching it wrong.
Yeah.
And I'm going to go with that really bold statement. Because AI, artificial intelligence, from the origin has been about the replacement of people. How can I build this algorithm that can beat a human? How can I build this algorithm that can replace a person, et cetera, and all these, glories and victories that we're celebrating is about this replacement. And I think that's fundamentally wrong. We should be looking at augmented intelligence. Yeah. How do we go about building these very sophisticated robots, intelligence, algorithm, and so forth that are designed to augment us? Because some things they do damn better than us. Some things we actually still do damn better than them. And if we take that underlying approach, we won't have to worry about these kind of these elements because they will always have a role for us. And I believe we'll always have that role.
Okay, we've run out of time, but let's just do one last poll. How many of you think AI will replace you as humans? Let's do a poll. How many of you? Raise your hands. No. 1, 2.
Yay, there's hope.
There's hope yet for humanity, guys. On that note, we've got to end up, but thank you very much for, can I have you guys a round of applause for our panelists today? Thank you very much.